Born in Chicago and raised in the First Church of Deliverance, Jerome Adams was a devoted son, a loyal friend, a talented actor and theater company manager, a hardworking associate producer for different drummers, and most of all, a dedicated servant of Christ. Jerome passed away on September 28, shortly after receiving his Doctor of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary. Today, to honor and remember Jerome, we welcome Reverend James R. Bryson, Jr., pastor of First Church of Deliverance. We also welcome David Crawford, president of McCormick Theological Seminary. Let's start by talking about Reverend Jerome. What is your favorite memory or story of him?
I would like to say that I have many. To pick one is a bit of a challenge, but how about I just pick one of the best because we've had a great time together. Jerome and I were finalists for the pastorate of First Church of Deliverance. There were 30-something folks that applied, whittled down to 20, went down to 10, and then it was 3. And me and Jerome were two of the 3. And so we were challenged to preach for 4 Sundays. So I would preach a Sunday, Jerome would preach a Sunday, and our friend Nash Schaefer, who was also in the finalists, he would preach a Sunday. The funny thing is that when they didn't have to preach, they didn't have to do anything else. And Jerome would always tease me because at the time I was the director of music. So I would be on the organ for them when they were preaching. And you know how we like to kind of boost each other when we were on the organ, right? And so we had come to an agreement that we were not running against each other, that we were simply just going to allow the Lord to pick the one that the Lord wanted, and we were going to support each other. It ended up being just that. And the night that I was elected, I was at the church, and Jerome called me, and he said to me that he knew all along that I was going to be the one that they picked, but he wanted to know how could he help me. And so Jerome and I had plans to do ministry together, and we did do ministry together for almost 3 years until his transition. But before his transition, Jerome was going to become a part of the ministry, pastoral ministry at First Church of Deliverance. My favorite story that's my favorite story because it showed me that no matter what, Jerome was always looking at the bigger picture, and he was looking at the big picture, and it wasn't personal for him that he did not become pastor. He simply just wanted to work in whatever capacity he could. I miss my friend.
One of the things that struck me when we sent out news that Jerome had passed to our community were the responses we received from everybody, from faculty, from staff, from students, from alums. All of them had these recurring themes about Jerome, that he was a light in our midst. The words love, kindness, gentleness, all these recurring things about Jerome, and it just came through in everything he did. He graduated with his Master of Divinity degree in 2010, and then came back and became part of the Jeremiah A. Wright Jr. Doctor of Ministry program, and he was a leader in that group and beloved. I mean, just beloved by every student, every member of the staff and faculty. We miss him.
Reverend Bryson, can we bring you into the conversation to talk about Reverend Jerome's connection to his church?
Absolutely. Jerome, born and raised at First Church of Deliverance, and First Church of Deliverance being well known as an embracing and welcoming congregation. This was very important to Jerome. And Jerome served as the Dean of Ministers Education. It's a title I created, but it fit perfectly exactly what we needed him to do. And what Jerome would do for us is to bring seminary level education to the local church. And so he did a survey of the Old Testament, a survey of the New Testament. He did some work with the epistles. And finally, his final project, which was part of his doctorate project, was a project called Deconstructing Homophobia in the Black Church. That was very, very important to Jerome. And I never will forget when he approached me with the idea, and he was a little timid at first because he didn't know how I was going to respond. And I said, Jerome, this is exactly what we need to do. And he was so relieved. And for a month, on every Saturday, he convened people from all across the city, from all walks of life, and they would convene, and we literally had this discussion. And we were literally deconstructing homophobia, which exists in the black church, and we wanted to deconstruct it. And so that was his last major accomplishment, and he was so proud of it. And it's something that we were honored that he chose his home church to sponsor it.
Pastor Bryson mentioned this during the memorial service for Jerome, and I was sitting with two of our faculty members, Professor Reggie Williams and Professor Sarah Tanzer. And Professor Tanzer is our New Testament professor. And so when you related that story, she was so full of just gratitude and emotion because she could hear in what Pastor Bryson was describing from what Jerome was teaching. She could hear what he had learned at McCormick in those words, and it was a beautiful service, end to end. But it was a particularly moving moment.
Both of them are my favorite, are two of my favorite professors as well. So I'm glad they were happy about that.
Yeah, we were Pastor Bryson and I had the just extraordinary experience and privilege of being with Jerome near the end of his life in hospice. We had not quite gotten to the end of his work in the Doctor of Divinity program, but he had completed the work required. And so we had the opportunity to gather with his friends and family, with his mom, with his siblings, Pastor Bryson and his son, Reverend Stacy Edwards Dunn, Dr. Wright, Dr. Jennifer McBride, who runs our Doctor of Ministry program, and to have this moment of being able to be with him and to confer upon him his Doctor of Ministry degree. And it was truly one of the most extraordinary moments that I've ever had during my time at McCormick or in my life, to be together with so many people who loved Jerome, and Jerome was awake for a good bit of that moment. In fact, his mother said he had sort of woken up when everybody gathered, and it was really an extraordinary moment. I'll never forget Dr. Wright, who was sitting by his bedside, and the blessing and benediction that he left before we all parted, and it was really one of the most beautiful blessings I've ever heard, and I've heard a lot of them, and it was just a really, really special moment.
Yes, Jerome lived a courageous life.
Yes, he did.
And I think we were there on, I think it was Thursday or Friday, but that Monday was when he was admitted into hospice, and he was quite a bit more cognizant and conversive. And so we had that talk that a pastor has with someone, where you reach a point where you realize that it is God's will that this person be elevated to the larger life, as opposed, because we don't die, we live on, we have eternal life. But there comes a point where that discussion has to be had. And I was so impressed with Jerome because he was fully talking. He had gone down so suddenly in hospice, but those first couple of days he was right there, mentally alert and conversing. And he said, Pastor, there comes a time where we just have to accept that ultimate healing is the transition to the larger life. And I said,
Wow.
Jerome, you are fantastic. You're awesome. He said, no, this is what I've been taught, and this is what I believe, and I believe I've done everything that God has called me to do. So the same courage that he used when he was out protesting against wrongs, whether in New York, Chicago, wherever he happened to be, protesting against injustices, that same courage was with him all the way to the end of his life on this side. And that, to me, spoke volumes about the character and integrity.
And you're speaking about his character. I'm wondering if you could share a little more about his courageous leadership. How was the congregation impacted, or those who were part of the theater that he helped to manage? Would you mind sharing about that?
So I know with Jerome, I'm not as familiar with his theater side. That had long ended when we became acquainted and became friends. But there are issues that he helped the church with, right? And so Jerome was very instrumental in our health and wellness initiative at a time where back in the early 80s, late 80s, mid 80s, somewhere around in there, where AIDS was a disease to be shunned, and the people, I mean, it was the modern day leprosy at that time, and people interpreted it that way. And Jerome was courageous and fought against that kind of stigmatism. Jerome also fought against the stigmatism when it came to same-sex marriage, because there were some in the congregation that wanted to be married, and they weren't quite sure how the congregation would receive that. This is before I became the pastor. And I discovered that Jerome had performed a number of those ceremonies. And I think, with no dispersion to anyone prior to me, I just know that the culture of the black church sometimes will cause us to ignore something or look the other way rather than confront it. That was not Jerome. Jerome was very happy confronting what he felt was injustice or discrimination or oppression. You know, our founder, Reverend Clarence H. Cobbs, has a statement that he makes, and it's embedded in each one of us. Next week we're celebrating, and Jerome used to be the radio announcer, right? We've had our radio program on for the last 84 consecutive years, right?
That's amazing.
Yes, and Jerome for a long time was the radio announcer as well, right? And so Reverend Cobbs was facing a lot of opposition because he was embracing during a time where it was not popular to be embracing, right? And while we're a sixth-generation church, we have everyone in our church, right? And everyone is welcome at our church, which is the reason why Jerome was there. But Reverend Cobbs would say something, and I say it every Sunday when I do the broadcast, that it makes no difference what you think of me, but it does make a difference what I think of you. I will not allow hate, prejudice, and all the things that separate men and women from God to keep me from knowing. This is what Jerome internalized. Jerome knew that what God had called him to do was to be a light in darkness for people. And I said I was not going to preach this on this, right? But Jerome brings that out of me because he lived such a courageous life. And it wasn't important whether a person understood nor liked him, although to know Jerome is to love him.
That's right.
Exactly.
So President Crawford, I want you to talk about Reverend Jerome's influence and leadership at McCormick. I know he was involved in the Leadership Summit, the HIV/AIDS
Yes.
Leadership Summit. I wonder if you can talk about that a little.
Now, I'm listening to Pastor Bryson talk about his work at the church and in the community, and we were just an extension of that. All of those issues that he dealt with so beautifully at the church, he brought that work to McCormick and inspired others to follow suit. And I think that was another one of the things about the memorial service that was so deeply meaningful to everyone there, was listening to Pastor Bryson talk about how that work will continue, both within the church, and I know at McCormick that's how people feel about it, whether it's the work on HIV/AIDS that it was such a passion for him, but it was also just his quiet leadership on that issue, on issues beyond HIV and AIDS to bring people together.
That's right.
Reverend Will Hall also had made some remarks at the memorial services and noted how when Jerome would ask you how you are, he really meant it. It wasn't something in passing. He wasn't sort of just checking in. It was something deeply felt that he wanted to know and hear, how are you? And what that meant to him and what it meant to the people who heard it from him.
That's
and
right.
so McCormick, as you know, is an extraordinarily diverse place, a wide range of views, not just racially, ethnically, ecumenically, but denominationally, but theologically. And so to have someone with the kind of spirit and the loving spirit and the kind and gentle spirit that Jerome had to take on difficult issues, and very difficult issues. And when we have those conversations in class, as you know, they can be very difficult and very trying. But through that gentle leadership, he changed the world. He changed us. He changed your congregation, and all for the good. And I think the great legacy is that we're all excited about the opportunity to carry on some of that legacy.
That's awesome. I was going to ask, is there anything at the church that continues the legacy that Reverend Jerome started?
Well, I would say that, yes, to answer your question in short, we're looking at our plans for 2020. One of the things that Jerome was very passionate about was education in the divinity school setting, in the seminary setting. And so one of the things that we have decided to do is to get with President Crawford and find a way that we can each year send someone else into the halls of McCormick, right, in the honor of Reverend Jerome Adams. The other thing that we are working on is the continuing education of the ministers that cannot afford or access a seminary education. It was very important. I'm glad that you said, Reggie and Sarah, were touched by that, because they may very well be people that I call to help me to bring some of that seminary experience, right? Reggie Williams, Dr. Reggie Williams, pastor at First Baptist Church in University Park, he already has done a prophetic preaching seminar there. I'm not trying to put the seminary out of business. I'm just trying to expand the reach of the seminary, because there are many people that are not able to attend seminary for various reasons, right? For most of us, this is kind of like a second or third career almost.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's not convenient for them. But Jerome, being our minister of, our Dean of Ministers Education, it was very important to him that we provide that kind of exposure to that kind of theological knowledge.
Thank you for joining us today, sharing such beautiful memories of Reverend Jerome, and I'm excited to know that the legacy of leadership that he began will continue. I'm LaShondra Stevens for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.